Today, we are diving into one of the shorter, but man, one of the most intense books in the Bible, the book of Nahum. It's this really gripping story about a terrifying empire, a prophet you might not have heard of, and it asks a pretty crucial question. What happens when God's patience finally runs out?
There's this old German poem that just hits the nail on the head for this topic. Though the mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceedingly small. It paints this picture of justice being slow, methodical, almost like these massive, ancient grinding stones. But the key is this: God's patience isn't the same thing as permission. Justice might take its time, but when it arrives, it is absolutely precise. And that's really the core tension we're going to unpack in the book of Nahum.
So, to really get Nahum, we've actually got to talk about another prophet first. One you probably know a lot better, Jonah. Right? The guy with the whale? Both of these men were sent to the exact same city, Nineveh, the capital of the absolutely brutal Assyrian Empire. They both came with a message of coming destruction. But that's where the similarities end. Their missions and the results couldn't have been more different.
And this is the crucial difference. Jonah's message, well, it was an appeal. Think of it like a final warning shot. It gave Nineveh a chance to repent and get mercy, which, believe it or not, they actually did. But Nahum's message? That was a verdict. The trial was over, the sentence was passed, the time for appeals was long gone.
A century and a half. That's how much time passed between these two prophecies. 150 years. I mean, think about that. That is an incredible amount of time for a culture to get its act together. And it just goes to show how long God waited. It's an almost shocking level of patience before that final judgment was declared.
I love this analogy because it gets the idea across perfectly. Divine judgment, at least in this story, isn't some sudden, impulsive explosion. It's more like a pot of milk on a stove. It heats up slowly, quietly. You might not even notice it's happening, and then all of a sudden, it boils over. If you're not paying attention, it's a total shock. But if you were watching, you could see the signs were all there. And by Nahum's time, that pot had definitely boiled over.
Okay, so who was this empire that managed to push divine patience right to its breaking point? Let's talk about the villain of our story, Assyria. In the ancient world, their name was basically a synonym for terror. They weren't just your average conquerors. They were masters of psychological warfare, famous for their unbelievable cruelty and their brutal methods of control.
You can see their relentless march right here on this timeline, specifically against the northern kingdom of Israel. And look, it wasn't a single event. First, they invaded and basically turned Israel into a vassal state, forcing them to pay tribute. Then, about 20 years later, they just came back to finish the job, conquering the rest of the kingdom, deporting like people, and scattering them all across the empire. These became known as the 10 Lost Tribes because they were, for all intents and purposes, erased from history by Assyrian policy.
So it's in this climate, this context of overwhelming, unstoppable terror, that Nahum delivers his message. He essentially walks into the heart of this beast and announces its end. So let's break down exactly what his prophecy said.
The book of Nahum is actually structured pretty brilliantly, almost like a 3-act play about judgment. Chapter 1 is the proclamation. It declares who is going to be affected when God finally acts. Chapter 2 is the description. This is a vivid, almost cinematic vision of how the city is going to fall. And chapter 3, that's the explanation. The moral reasoning for why this judgment is not only necessary but completely just. Now, early on, Nahum uses a word that can make us a little uncomfortable: jealousy. But we have to understand, this is not human envy, where you want something you don't have. Divine jealousy is more like the righteous, protective passion of a rightful owner. It's God protecting his name, his people, and his world from being ruined by limitless cruelty. It's like a declaration that says, hey, this is my creation and I will not let you tear it apart. Okay, in the second act of this prophecy, Nahum gets breathtakingly specific. I mean, he doesn't just say Nineveh will fall. He describes the entire scene with such vivid detail that it honestly reads like a movie script written centuries before the camera started rolling.
Get this, the prophecy includes these incredible details. He talks about the attackers wearing scarlet uniforms, the absolute chaos of chariots jamming the streets, and just widespread panic. But the most stunning prediction? A critical breach through the river gates. And guess what? History tells us this is precisely how Nineveh fell. An enemy army diverted a river and marched into the city through the now vulnerable water gates, exactly as Nahum had foreseen.
And here's where we see some incredible poetic justice. Assyria's national symbol was the lion. They carved lions all over their palaces as this sign of their predatory dominance. So Nahum takes that very symbol and he turns it right back on them. He describes a den of lions that has suddenly become weak and hunted. The ultimate predator has become the prey.
Okay, so we're talking about a prophecy of total annihilation. It sounds incredibly harsh, right? So how on earth could this message possibly be considered a positive thing? Or as the Bible itself calls it, good news? Well, this requires a pretty big shift in our perspective. Let's just ask the question directly. How can a message about the complete and utter destruction of a city, a culture, an entire empire, how can that ever be framed as good news? I mean, who would possibly be celebrating this? This famous biblical quote is tied directly to this very idea. The message is good news, not for the oppressor, but for the oppressed. The feet of the messenger are considered beautiful because they are racing to announce that the long reign of terror is finally over.
Right, we have to remember Nahum was born under Assyrian occupation. For him, and for all the other nations that were being crushed under Assyria's boot, the fall of Nineveh wasn't some tragedy, it was liberation. It was the announcement that evil doesn't get to rule forever, and that the moral order of the universe was about to be set right again.
So, as we start to wrap this up, the story of Nahum, especially when you put it right next to the story of Jonah, it leaves us with this powerful, lasting tension between three huge ideas: God's immense patience, his deep desire for mercy, and his ultimate commitment to justice. This is Nahum's chilling final verdict to Nineveh. And honestly, it's one of the most frightening lines in the whole Bible. Why? Because it confirms that mercy, when it's refused for long enough, is eventually withdrawn. It tells us that there is, in fact, such a thing as too late.
You know, a great way to think about these two books is not that they contradict each other, but that they're companions. They're two sides of the same coin. Jonah's story is all about testing the limits of God's mercy, showing just how far it can go, even to the people who seem to deserve it the least. And Nahum's story? It shows the boundary line. It shows the point where continuing to be patient would no longer be merciful to the victims, but actually unjust.
And the historical record on this is just staggering. Nineveh's destruction was so total, the city was literally wiped off the map. I mean, for centuries, people thought it was a myth because no one could even find the ruins. It wasn't until the 19th century that it was rediscovered, which just confirmed the terrifying accuracy of the prophecy. The mills of God had finished grinding. And so we end right back where we started, with this really difficult question. Nahum's story forces us to think about this balance. At what point does being patient in the face of evil become a form of injustice to the victims of that evil? It's a question that shows us how true holiness seems to require both profound mercy and, eventually, unwavering justice.